Humanity's limits will be tested in the final battle for survival. When a massive asteroid hurtles straight toward Earth, humanity has only one chance: a desperate effort to alter the planet's fate. But can they change the orbit of death? Can mankind stand firm against the catastrophe, or will it all end in the ruins of mistakes made too late? Join us to uncover this dramatic story, where the fate of survival lies not only in the hands of heroes, but also teaches a profound lesson about the power of the human spirit. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our next thrilling tales. Together, we will face this cosmic challenge. On a peaceful morning, the world was enveloped in the stillness of any other ordinary day. The sky was a clear blue, with wisps of clouds floating delicately like thin silk, and the busy cities continued their usual hurried pace. Yet something extraordinary was about to change everything. At that moment, no one could have predicted that life on Earth was facing a terrifying, inevitable danger, not from within the planet, but from the vast, unexplored reaches of space. On April 17, 2025, within a cutting-edge laboratory at the International Space Research Center, an unusual signal was detected. It wasn't like any signal the scientists had ever studied before. Initially, it appeared to be a faint blip on the radar, possibly a technical error or a harmless signal from a malfunctioning satellite. But after a thorough analysis, the scientists realized that it was not that at all. The signal came from beyond the solar system, with intensity and frequency never seen before. It was not a random transmission from an astronomical object or a satellite. This was a clear message. "Thank you to those who hear this signal," was the first line of the message, painstakingly decoded over hours. Those involved in the decryption process felt a chill unlike any they had ever known. They couldn't believe their eyes as they read the words. "We are not asking for help. We only request technical data on how to prevent a collision with an asteroid that could destroy Earth." These words struck like lightning on a clear day, reverberating around the globe. Scientists, world leaders, and ordinary citizens were all shocked. No one had ever imagined that one day Earth would face such a dire threat. What was more shocking was that this message did not come from alien beings, but from humans living on another planet who had discovered a horrific threat to us. The nature of this message wasn't merely a plea for help. It carried a strange humility, an exhaustion that could not be expressed in words. The world's nations had never faced a challenge like this before. How could they stop a massive asteroid hurtling toward Earth, one that could erase all life on the planet? At the International Space Research Center, an emergency meeting was called immediately. Leading scientists, technical experts from across the world, and government officials gathered in the same room. The atmosphere was so tense that no one dared to breathe too loudly. Everyone could feel the anxiety filling the air. An elderly man with silver hair, Professor Xavier, stood up and spoke. "What we are facing is a global catastrophe. The entire Earth could be wiped out if we do not find a solution in time. Everything we know about science, about technology, may not be enough. But we must do something, even if it means sacrificing everything." From that moment on, no one could imagine what would unfold next. Nations began channeling all their resources, manpower, and technology into finding a way to prevent the asteroid collision. Satellites, spacecraft, and the military's nuclear arsenals were all mobilized to confront this looming danger. Yet, despite some advancements in collision prevention technologies, nothing seemed sufficient to handle the scale of the threat. A few days later, an unbelievable event occurred. Another signal appeared on the radar screens, this time more powerful and clearer, with a message that was truly chilling. The asteroid will collide with Earth in 18 months. Time is of the essence. We do not ask for rescue, only technical data on preventive measures. The calm of the world was shattered. Nations and international organizations, once proud of their scientific and technological superiority, were now gripped with fear. They weren't just facing an invisible threat. They were confronted with a question that had no clear answer. Would they have the capability to change the fate of the planet? Each passing second amplified the panic. Countries began to alter the way they operated. Scientists worked around the clock, without rest or respite. Every decision they made could influence the destiny of all humanity. With each second, the countdown to the end of Earth became more urgent. Meanwhile, high above in the vastness of space, small dots of light began to appear, like omens signaling the end of all life on this blue planet. Humanity's fight for survival was not just a battle against a massive asteroid, but also a battle against the panic, the lack of information, and the uncertainty of the future. After the message from the universe, the global atmosphere became extremely tense. Every country, every international organization, from the United Nations to space agencies, faced a critical question. What will we do to respond to this cosmic disaster? Emergency conferences were held worldwide, but the division and disagreement among nations only made the situation more strained than ever before. On May 3rd, at the United Nations Summit in New York, representatives from major powers, as well as experts in the field of space science, gathered. A large conference room bathed in cold white light, with a large round table in the center, where leaders stood face to face, like warriors preparing for a battle. Each person understood that this conference would not only affect their own country, but the entire human race. "We are facing an unprecedented crisis in history," said the United Nations Secretary General Raymond Thorne, beginning his speech with a tense look. "If we do not act immediately, Earth will face an unavoidable cosmic catastrophe. But the question is, how will we respond?" A murmur spread throughout the room. Representatives from various countries began discussing fervently, but the atmosphere was heavy. Each country had its own plans, and the proposed solution seemed insufficient to convince anyone. Some major nations, like the United States and Russia, wanted to use nuclear weapons to destroy the asteroid, while others, like Japan and European nations, preferred to focus on research and development of space deflection technologies, aiming for technical solutions rather than direct confrontation. "We cannot just sit here and wait for miracles," said U.S. President Thomas Larkin, his voice resolute. "We can build nuclear weapons strong enough to destroy the asteroid. We cannot risk just sending technical data." A voice from the European nations responded, "Nuclear weapons may be a quick solution, but what if it fails? A nuclear explosion could break the asteroid into thousands of pieces, making the danger much worse. Instead, we need a precise technical strategy, like the deflection system we've been researching for years." The debate grew more intense as representatives from other countries stood up to speak, each defending their position. The poorer nations, lacking the technology or resources to execute complex plans, called for global cooperation and resource sharing. "We cannot face this disaster alone," said Indian Prime Minister Priya Rajan. "Without support from stronger nations, countries like ours will not be able to participate in this fight." The tension increased as countries with technological advantages debated whether they should share their most classified information on space and nuclear technology. The wealthier nations were reluctant to share their advanced technologies for fear of revealing secrets to unfriendly adversaries. "If we share all technical data, who can guarantee that enemies won't use it against us?" said a representative from Israel. These sharp remarks only intensified the division at the summit. The feeling of anxiety spread throughout the room. Every country had to struggle with not only the survival of Earth, but also its own interests and the protection of valuable resources. The ongoing disputes highlighted that this crisis was not only a battle with space, but also a conflict among civilizations on this planet. In this context, a figure unexpectedly entered the conference room. It was Professor Nguyen Minh An, a leading scientist from Vietnam, who had spent many years studying space and astronomical phenomena. "Excuse me, I know this conference is tense, but I have a solution that might bring hope to all of us," he said, his voice full of determination. He walked to the podium, unconcerned by the skeptical looks from the representatives of major countries, and began to present a revolutionary plan, using the gravitational forces from planets within the solar system to create a push network to divert the asteroid off course. Although there were still many doubts, his plan garnered significant attention. Everyone in the room fell silent, listening intently to every word Professor Minh An spoke. Countries began to realize that this might be the only opportunity for them to cooperate and save the planet. Any disagreement, no matter how small, could cost the planet its survival. "We cannot hesitate any longer," said Secretary General Thorne after hearing Professor Minh An's proposal. "If we don't act now, Earth's survival will be gone." And so, in a meeting filled with tension, humanity began to enter a battle not only with space, but also with itself. But could they overcome their differences to protect the planet together? Everything depended on the decisions they would make in the coming days. Following the historic meeting at the United Nations, where world representatives finally agreed on a global cooperation plan, humanity entered a phase of critical urgency and mounting tension. While the nations had agreed on the plan to use the gravitational forces of planets within the solar system to adjust the asteroid's trajectory, this agreement did not guarantee an easy path ahead. The preparations, the comprehensive changes in how nations, economies, and societies operated, presented a monumental challenge. Scientists and space experts began developing technologies that previously seemed to belong only to the realm of science fiction. They were tasked with building new systems, unprecedented defense devices, and focusing on optimizing the use of the gravitational forces of massive planets like Jupiter. Each country started sharing resources, but underlying competition still persisted. Every scientist, engineer, and official had to contend with resource shortages, imperfect technologies, and complex logistical problems. Space companies and global military forces were mobilized to their maximum potential. Rocket manufacturing plants, launch systems, and space-related devices were operating at full capacity, running 24 hours a day. Workers in weapon factories, spacecraft production facilities, and other supporting technologies worked tirelessly, day and night, to meet the set objectives. However, beneath the surface, significant tensions remained unresolved. The poorer nations, despite their efforts to contribute, felt sidelined as wealthier countries held control over the technology and key decisions. In major cities across the globe, anxiety and panic began to escalate. Families started preparing for the uncertain days ahead. Shelters, designed to withstand natural disasters, began to be constructed. In safer zones, where research facilities and humanitarian organizations worked to assist the disadvantaged, no one dared to feel confident about survival. Even though governments were doing everything they could, the sense of helplessness in the face of the scale of the threat was unavoidable. At the International Space Research Center, a team of scientists worked through the night, applying precise calculations and new theoretical models to prepare for the next step. They researched how Jupiter's gravity could help create the necessary force to divert the asteroid's trajectory, and initial tests had shown promising results. Rocket launch systems were being designed to fire satellites and positioning devices into space, ready to alter the asteroid's course. Yet, every mistake in this process could lead to a global disaster. Meanwhile, international military forces began assembling, Military spacecraft were used to perform space missions, while countries were carrying out military projects to ensure they could protect themselves in the event of a catastrophe. However, the battle was not only against nature, but also against the internal divisions within each country. The darker side of international cooperation was the underlying tensions over power and interests. Wealthier countries were reluctant to share their advanced technologies with less developed nations, which lacked the resources or knowledge to fully participate in the global project. While the developed nations agreed to share some technologies, they were cautious about disclosing all their technical data and methods. Some nations even feared that sharing information about space technology could be exploited, creating future inequality in international relations once the asteroid was successfully diverted. These tensions were not just confined to nations, but extended to individuals. Scientists, those responsible for building and developing life-saving technologies, began to feel exhausted and anxious. They knew that every passing day brought the risk of catastrophe, and the progress they had made was still far too little compared to the enormous workload bearing down on them. More importantly, they understood that diverting the asteroid was a high-risk strategy. If it failed, the situation could become far worse. Nevertheless, a sense of unity began to form as nations realized that without cooperation, their one opportunity to save the planet would slip away. Every country, whether rich or poor, whether equipped with technology or not, had to participate in this battle for survival. Leaders, experts, and international organizations now understood that everyone would have to pay a heavy price, and they had only one shot at success. Although the world had united in action, this battle was not just about technology. It was a battle of spirit and will. Every country had to sacrifice a part of its power and authority to create a unified front. The price of survival was not just in material resources, but in the spiritual bond between nations. And in all the preparations, one question kept echoing in the hearts of every person on Earth. Could humanity overcome its divisions and survive in a world filled with danger? Or would everything be destroyed in the final moments? In that suffocating and tense atmosphere, humanity could only move forward. There was no stopping, no giving up, because if they did, this Earth would pay the price with a despair that could never be undone. Day had arrived. After weeks of tireless preparation and research, the entire world had mobilized for action. Satellite and nuclear missile systems were deployed everywhere, with the only hope being to destroy or, at the very least, alter the trajectory of the asteroid hurtling toward Earth. The meticulous preparation and advanced technology of the nations seemed to be the final solution. Everything had been placed on this campaign. However, from the very first moments of the deployment process, the cracks in the plan began to show. At NASA's Space Defense Center, engineers and scientists were working around the clock. One team focused on launching nuclear missiles at the asteroid, while another was preparing satellites for launch, all in a desperate attempt to divert the massive object approaching. The tension was palpable as time was running out. Every passing second became a race against death. The first technical failure struck. It all started when the first missile was launched into space. The scene was broadcast live to the world. People watched in hope, hoping for a miracle, a salvation. But after the missile left the launch pad, it suddenly lost communication. Remote operators could not identify the cause. Just minutes later, warning signals blared. The automatic control system reported an error, and a small but powerful explosion occurred in space. A series of reports from space stations revealed that the missile had failed to reach the asteroid, and a small part of it had broken into thousands of pieces, creating a much greater risk. A devastating failure. No one could believe their eyes. The scientists, who had worked tirelessly to establish the defense strategy, were now confronted with an unimaginable defeat. All data collected showed that the asteroid was not destroyed, but merely fragmented into thousands of pieces, all continuing to hurtle toward Earth at double the speed. Reports were immediately sent to high command. Nations, including the United States, the European Union, and Russia, held emergency meetings. Everyone was tense, staring at each other anxiously. This failure was not just a technical one, but a spiritual collapse. They had prepared for the worst, but no one had anticipated failure right from the start. As fear reached its peak. Following the first failure, panic began to spread. Major countries like the US, Russia, and European nations found themselves on the defensive. They began heated debates on how to proceed with alternative measures. New plans were proposed continuously, but each one faced insurmountable barriers. No one dared to assert that success was even possible. Technologies were developing too quickly, and the experiments had never yielded the expected results. Even during tense meetings between international experts, no one had enough confidence to make the final decision. Some national leaders began to question whether this international collaboration was truly viable, as national interests began to take precedence in crucial decisions. The second campaign begins. In any case, the world had no choice. Another campaign had to be launched. This time, the nations decided not to use nuclear weapons but to test new methods, including powerful jet systems and electromagnetic launch devices, supported by satellite systems. These technologies had been researched for years, but had never been tested in such a high-stakes situation. Everyone in the control rooms was aware that they were gambling not only with Earth's fate, but also with the prestige and honor of their respective nations. Once again, the plan failed. The satellites launched into space were unable to reach the necessary speed to overcome the asteroid's power. Space defense forces began to realize that they were losing control. The satellite launch systems, although improved, were still not strong enough to create the necessary thrust. The satellites merely left faint streaks of light in the sky, unable to make any significant change. Worries intensified. Scientists and government officials began to realize that they were not only battling an asteroid, they were battling time itself, and each decision, each alternative, could lead to failure or catastrophe. Desperation began to spread throughout the laboratories and command centers. No one could maintain their composure, and fear began to dominate crucial decisions. They had failed to stop the asteroid, and the world was now bracing for what was believed to be a global catastrophe. But within this failure, one question lingered in the minds of all. Could they find a solution when all the plans had failed? After two disastrous failures in previous campaigns, the world found itself at a crossroads, filled with risk and uncertainty. Panic spread across the globe, but amidst the ashes of failure, a small spark of hope flickered. Scientists and engineers no longer had the luxury of lamenting past mistakes. There were no more long meetings filled with criticisms and arguments. Instead, they focused on finding a new solution, one that had never been tested before. Only by doing so could they save their planet. The meeting took place on a gloomy morning, where the light from the room's glass windows seemed insufficient to illuminate the anxious atmosphere of those gathered. Despite the dwindling hope, all the leaders, experts, and influential individuals had no choice but to sit together and find a way out for humanity. The room was almost silent, as everyone felt the weight of time and the imminent danger they faced. A new plan was proposed. The final solution came from an unexpected corner knot by improving nuclear missiles or satellites, but through a strategy never before considered. Using the gravitational power of the planets in the solar system, particularly Jupiter, to create a lever strong enough to alter the asteroid's course. This plan was not easy, and it was full of challenges. But after all the failures, this was the only opportunity left. This solution was named Project Orbital Beast, an unattractive name, but one carrying immense responsibility. Scientists would need to send a series of spacecraft equipped with launch devices and special equipment that could anchor onto the asteroid, creating a gravitational pull from Jupiter to alter its trajectory. A team of engineers would have to calculate every detail meticulously to ensure that no small error could occur. This time, they wouldn't just be dealing with an asteroid, but a complex network of space devices, each part needing to operate flawlessly for success. However, this solution wasn't without risks. The scientists could not guarantee 100% that the plan would succeed. After all previous experiments had failed, and there was no certainty that everything would go smoothly this time. But the crucial factor was the limited time left. If they did not act, humanity would have no chance of survival. This reality forced everyone into a position where they had to act, despite knowing that failure could bring about even worse consequences. Nations began to rapidly shift from the Cold War mindset to cooperation in a battle for survival. Countries, which had unresolved disputes for centuries, now focused all their resources on one singular goal. The United States, China, Russia, and European countries worked together to develop and produce specialized spacecraft. However, nations faced a significant problem: cost. To implement this plan, trillions of dollars needed to be mobilized. Weaker economies began to feel immense pressure under the weight of the space projects. International organizations had to exert all their efforts to allocate financial resources effectively. The battle for survival was not just taking place in space. On the ground, the tension was just as high. Countries were grappling with unprecedented issues. In major cities, people began preparing for an uncertain future. Shelters and protective zones were hastily built, but they were merely preparation for an unseen disaster. Families gradually realized that this was not a normal natural catastrophe, but an event that could entirely destroy civilization. Meanwhile, selected astronaut teams were trained for the space campaign. These individuals would be the first to approach the asteroid, and their mission was not only to operate the equipment, but also to ensure the safety of all devices launched into space. The astronauts, although highly trained, knew that this mission was a deadly gamble. Everything they did could impact the survival of all humanity. They would be the first to set foot on land no one had ever explored before, where every mistake could lead to death. The sacrifice was not only coming from space, but perhaps the greatest sacrifice was on the ground. Nations began to readjust their economies. Resources were reallocated, and the global economy faced a severe decline. Major companies, once at the top of the weapons and technology industries, now poured their efforts into building spacecraft and defense technologies. However, with the unequal distribution of resources, social tensions began to rise. The poor no longer had the means to purchase basic necessities, while the wealthier nations seized the precious time to develop space projects. Meanwhile, complaints about the injustice of resource distribution began to echo everywhere, creating an unstable social atmosphere. A fragile hope. Despite everything, each day that passed saw scientists and engineers around the world working tirelessly. The spacecraft were completed, the satellites were launched into space, and research teams continuously provided predictions about the asteroid's trajectory. A colossal equation was being solved step by step, though each step required absolute precision. The sacrifices of time, money, and human lives had surpassed all imaginable limits. But although no one could predict the outcome, everyone understood that this was humanity's final opportunity. And if this campaign failed, Earth would never get a second chance. The only choice now was to press on, despite everything, because if they didn't, life would no longer exist. The decisive day arrived, and the atmosphere was tense across the entire planet. Every second that passed, the world watched the movements of the spacecraft launched into space, preparing for the final battle to save Earth. Humanity was no longer just facing a cosmic disaster. It was a battle for survival, where there was no room for error. One failure would mean total destruction. All hope was placed on the astronauts and the space engineering team, the final warriors of this planet. The massive launch systems began their operation. At space stations around the world, the giant rocket and satellite launch systems were activated. The spacecraft, carrying the special devices developed in international laboratories, began their journey. Each spacecraft carried the most powerful weapons, technologies, and equipment that humanity could develop. These were not just regular rockets or satellites. They were tools designed to alter the asteroid's orbit, only hope to save Earth. The astronauts aboard these spacecraft faced not only technical challenges, but also powerful personal emotions. They knew this might be the last time they would see their families, friends, and the world they loved. A group of astronauts, the bravest from all over the world, had been selected to carry out this extraordinary mission. Fear mixed with determination filled the hearts of each one. They understood that their mission was not just to stop an asteroid, but to protect everything humanity had built throughout its history. Feelings of helplessness and tension. Despite the advanced technology, the readiness, and the unparalleled sacrifice, no one could be completely certain about the outcome. Inside their spacecraft, the astronauts listened intently to every strange noise from the control systems and watched every signal on their screens. Each second they had to maintain focus, as even the smallest mistake could lead to a catastrophic failure. They knew this battle was not just a scientific mission, but the final fight for humanity's survival. Meanwhile, back on Earth, ordinary people could only wait and pray. Governments advised their citizens to prepare for the worst-case scenario. But one undeniable truth remained. No matter how much humanity prepared, the fate of the planet now depended entirely on the success of the asteroid prevention plan. There was no plan B, no alternative choice. All hopes rested on this fight in space. The defining moment. As the spacecraft neared the asteroid, the tension reached its peak. Images from the spacecraft were transmitted back to Earth through cosmic signals. The clear images of the asteroid appeared on screens around the world, its glowing streaks visible against the darkness of space, drawing closer to the planet that all of humanity was connected to. Every time a satellite was launched, every time a rocket system was activated, the weight of that moment's responsibility was felt by all. All systems had to work perfectly. Each time a rocket was launched, the astronauts in space breathed a sigh of relief, but there was no time for celebration. As the satellites began approaching the asteroid, the thrust from the jet systems started to have a slight impact on the asteroid's orbit. The spacecraft's computers calculated every change, second by second. Everything depended on making the correct orbital shift at the right time, in the right position. A slight miscalculation and everything would fail. The danger was incalculable. And then, an unexpected failure occurred. During the maneuvering process, one of the satellites failed to achieve the necessary speed to approach the asteroid. One of the sensor systems malfunctioned, causing the thrust to be insufficient to make a significant change in the orbit. A warning blared from the monitoring system aboard the spacecraft. System error. The asteroid has not been affected enough to change its orbit. Despite this, the astronauts had no time to dwell on the issue. They immediately activated the backup systems. All remaining devices had to be activated immediately. They continued to fight against the ticking clock, every moment pushing forward relentlessly. A group of astronauts decided to use auxiliary jet systems to boost the thrust, despite the immense risks. If they failed, the system would cause total collapse. At this point, the entire world held its breath. On Earth, images of the rocket launch were broadcast live across all media platforms. People stood together, praying and waiting for the outcome. Cold sweat began to drip from the brows of world leaders, those who had always prided themselves on their success in handling crises. But now, the tension within them was impossible to hide. At a space command center, where strategy teams and system operators worked, the operators could barely breathe. They awaited the final signal, full of hope and anxiety. The initial predictions had not shown the results they had hoped for. All they could do was wait for the message from the astronauts in space, the final warriors of humanity. The asteroid begins to change course. And finally, after moments that felt like centuries, a signal came. System operating as expected, the voice of the lead astronaut echoed through the cosmic waves, choked but filled with hope. The asteroid, although not completely destroyed, had begun to change its course. Just a little further, once the remaining satellites completed their tasks, the asteroid's orbit would shift enough to avoid collision with Earth. Though exhaustion and tension still enveloped them, humanity had overcome a massive challenge. There had been a victory, though small. It was the first victory in a fight for survival. But they knew this was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, and the world was not yet free from danger. The entire planet now faced a question that no one could answer with certainty. Had they truly saved Earth? Or was it merely a temporary delay, a painful drama before the tragic end? The astronauts in space, despite their initial success in altering the asteroid's orbit, could not be sure whether that shift was strong enough to prevent the cosmic object from colliding directly with Earth. Everything now was a race against time. As the final satellites completed their mission and signals were sent back to Earth, international leaders and scientists began to listen to the detailed reports from space. Every number, every small sign could either signal survival or death. The computers analyzed the asteroid's orbit, but as soon as the first report was released, a piece of information struck the entire space campaign team with shock. The asteroid has not altered its course enough to completely avoid impact. While there has been a slight shift, there is still a possibility that the asteroid will continue towards Earth on a dangerous path. An emergency meeting was called. At the United Nations headquarters, where representatives from the world's largest nations gathered, the atmosphere was ominous. Everyone understood that the survival of the planet now depended not just on complex technology or calculations, but on the ability to handle the situation in the final moments. The world had only one option left: act immediately or accept failure and face the unimaginable consequences. UN Secretary-General Raymond Thorne stood, his voice filled with worry but also determination. We failed in the previous tests, but now is the moment of truth. We don't have much time left. What remains is the final fight for survival. Military officials, scientists, and experts from around the world participated in the meeting, their spirits tense beyond measure. They knew that the only strategy left to save Earth was to develop a new method immediately. One of the proposals presented was to use a backup system that had been developed by scientists but never before tested. Using the thrusting devices from the satellites, combined with Jupiter's gravitational forces, to create a final impact on the asteroid, making it change direction enough to avoid a direct collision. Although this plan had many aspects still underdeveloped, the leaders had no choice but to accept and deploy it immediately. Spacecraft, satellites, and all remaining devices were activated in those final hours, regardless of the risks. The world seemed to hold its breath, all eyes focused on the cosmic signals, awaiting the results from this life-or-death battle. The cosmic storm was approaching. One day passed, then two, and then three. Every update from space was an unpredictable stream of reports. The satellites were moving closer than ever before, but every time there was a slight change, people could hear the collective sigh of anxiety. In the spacecraft command rooms, engineers and scientists could no longer hide their exhaustion and fear. They no longer had a sense of time. Each second felt like crushing pressure. On Earth, countries began preparing for what was deemed the worst-case scenario. Shelters were expanded, rescue teams were retrained, and ready to cope with the aftermath of the disaster. Cities began to prepare for the possibility of massive devastation, while ordinary citizens fell into a state of anxiety and dread. Those who had prepared for the worst began to feel that what they once thought was far away was now far too close. The final moment approached. On the last day, the tension reached its peak. The spacecraft finally neared the asteroid, and from the control rooms, signals were transmitted. The scientists realized that there was only one last chance to alter the asteroid's orbit entirely. One mistake, no matter how small, could lead to the destruction of the entire planet. And then, as the final satellites were launched, a moment of silence enveloped the world. In the control rooms, the screens flashed the final results. At least humanity's chances of survival still existed. But the truth was, this victory was not the end. Soon after the good news was broadcast, another major issue arose. Scientists discovered that while the asteroid's course had changed, it still hadn't fully escaped its orbit. Though it had avoided direct impact, there was still a possibility of debris falling to Earth, as fragments of the asteroid might break off due to gravitational interactions. The question was once again raised. Could humanity face what was coming next? Or would they once again witness their complete collapse? The battle for survival was far from over. In those final moments when life and death were just a step apart, the entire world could do nothing but hold its breath, waiting for signals from space. After humanity's colossal efforts, the asteroid had finally begun to alter its course. But the question remained. Was this salvation, or was it merely a tragic delay, the death knell for Earth? This question haunted millions on the planet. One outcome could decide the fate of all life, but another could signal the end of everything. As the final signals from the spacecraft and satellites transmitted back to Earth, no one in the control rooms dared to move. They had waited for this result for countless days and nights, and now every eye was fixed on the screen. The numbers on the digital displays, the lines of text appeared filled with anxiety. The asteroid has altered its course, but not enough. The orbital shift is insufficient to completely avoid collision. What the scientists and astronauts could do now was only wait. One opportunity had passed, and it seemed that Earth had avoided a direct impact. Yet, no one could claim that everything was finished. There remained the possibility that the asteroid would break into smaller fragments, or that these pieces could trigger unpredictable explosions as they entered Earth's atmosphere. From space stations to underground bunkers, everyone exhaled in relief, but the worry still simmered deep inside. So, we've saved this planet, but what about the debris? A scientist's voice rang out in the control room, cutting through the silence. The entire room froze. No one dared to answer. All eyes were now fixed on the computer screens, where a vague prediction began to emerge. Fragments from the asteroid had started to enter Earth's orbit, and once again, humanity faced a new possibility. The collision would not come from a single asteroid, but from a series of colossal debris that could cause catastrophic damage. Beneath the ground, preparations for the worst-case scenario began to take shape. Shelters had been built, but would they be enough to protect billions if these asteroid fragments caused a global catastrophe? Experts began to recalculate backup plans, assessing the level of danger from the anticipated collisions in the weeks ahead. The satellites had failed to destroy the asteroid, and now they were facing the possibility that they would only create more serious problems. An ominous scene appeared on the screens. Fragments of the asteroid began to break off, racing through space like massive projectiles, preparing to fall onto Earth. People around the world could do nothing but pray. In the major cities, streets lay deserted, survivors bracing for the worst, while rescue teams waited for evacuation orders. No one was sure whether life could continue. In the spacecraft control rooms, another emergency meeting was called. This time, the scientists were no longer people who could easily propose theoretical plans. There was no time to double-check data. A decision was made. The sky needed to be cleared before the fragments hit Earth. Satellites would be launched to create a shield, using energy from the satellites to emit powerful laser beams that would destroy the fragments before they could enter the atmosphere. However, this was not an easy decision. The smaller fragments that the satellites could not clean up would still pose risks, potentially causing regional disasters with shockwaves strong enough to destroy cities. Every city around the world, from New York to Tokyo, from Paris to Cairo, was preparing for the worst. Rescue teams were on maximum alert, ready to face the most catastrophic scenarios. The crucial hours passed. On one hazy night, when the sky no longer seemed calm as before, signals continued to be sent from the satellites. The computers recalculated the orbits of the fragments, confirming that some areas on Earth could be severely affected. But was that all? People in those areas began preparing for an unpredictable future, while the leaders silently monitored every signal and report. One thing was clear: humanity had no choice but to continue fighting. Although they could not be sure of the final outcome, in that moment, when the world stood on the brink of annihilation, they understood that they could only keep fighting until the very last moment. The ending of this story was not an easy one. Earth may have avoided total destruction, but what it faced was not eternal life, but a world in change, a planet still grappling with challenges never before encountered. But still, this planet kept spinning, and humanity continued to march forward.